The day begins with silence, the kind of silence you only notice in a sky big enough to hide a fleet. Below it, somewhere east of the Marianas, two armadas move by geometry and guesswork. On one side, Task Force 58, the spear point of American carrier power. 4 task groups of fast carriers, battleships, cruisers, destroyers, a moving city under Admiral Raymond Spruance and his carrier commander, Mark Mitscher. On the other, Jisaburo Ozawa's mobile fleet, the last concentrated carrier striking arm the Imperial Japanese Navy can still gather, built around the new armored deck flagship Taihō and their famous sisters Shokaku and Zuikaku. Neither commander can see the other. Both feel the clock running. In Washington and Tokyo, the war has numbers tonnage sunk, sorties flown, islands taken. Out here, it's smaller things that matter. The buzz in a ready room when a pilot learns he will fly second section in the first wave. The stiffness in a sailor's hands as he checks a tie-down chain twice, then a third time. The taste of diesel in the air near a destroyer's stacks. The thin paper bearing weather figures that promises morning wind from the southeast and squalls dotting the afternoon horizon. Up on the carrier's islands, men scan with binoculars. But at this distance, even a formation of dozens of ships leaves no visible mark on the blue. The ocean is the same as it has always been, empty until abruptly it isn't. The date is June 19th, 1944. 3 days earlier, American Marines had stepped ashore on Saipan, leaning forward into a fight that would put B-29s within range of Tokyo and crack the inner ring of Japan's defense. The combined fleet cannot allow Saipan to fall. Ozawa has been ordered to go out and fight. He knows the odds are bad. He knows his pilots are green. But he still carries something the Japanese Navy has used as a weapon since the first day at Pearl Harbor. Surprise born of boldness. He intends to strike from beyond the edge of what the Americans think is possible, using long-legged aircraft backed by land-based fighters from Guam and Rota. The plan is neat on paper. Reality has rough edges. Spruance, cautious by temperament and charged with protecting the invasion force, refuses to be lured too far west. It is Mitscher's job to make the carriers hit like a hammer, and he stands on the flag bridge of USS Lexington watching a blank horizon and feeling the limits of radar. Radio and human sight fuse into a single restraint. He wants to run. He wants to sprint west and smash Ozawa's carriers before they can launch. Spruance holds him in, protective as a parent, fearful of a fast turn that could open a gap into which Japanese aircraft might pour. The debate between them is not a shouted argument. It is a tension in the air, a string drawn tight across a chart table. The story that follows will be written on that string, in the space between caution and audacity. And into that space, at 0830, the first Japanese scouts creep. What nobody on either flagship sees is the shape this day will take. They cannot read that 2 American submarines, the old killers of this theater, patient and unloved, are prowling along the paths Ozawa's ships must cross. They cannot know that a single torpedo, fired from a few thousand yards against a brand new carrier, will take hours to do its fatal work in the invisible pathways of gasoline vapor and human error. They cannot imagine that the great fleets will fight, and one side will lose 3 carriers without a single American carrier being scratched by a bomb or torpedo. This is the battle later nicknamed the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot for the one-sided massacre in the air. That phrase carries bravado and, for some, and uncomfortable smugness. But inside the phrase, there are also voices you don't hear. Young Japanese pilots with 60 hours in the seat making their first combat approach over a forest of American anti-aircraft fire, and American aviators who will fly into the dusk to hit a target almost out of reach, then turn back toward a night ocean and fuel gauges dropping toward zero. The day is a study in contrasts. The effortless look of victory and the effort that makes it possible. The soundless view from a photograph and the sound of a carrier deck at full tempo. Somewhere beneath the sun that is already burning the varnish on the gunnels, the first Japanese strike groups are lifting off. American radar sets 60 miles east are already turning, sniffing for distant echoes. A submarine far ahead of the blue silhouettes that lodge in human imagination when we say fleet, quietly steadies to fire. The line of history has passed under these ships, the point where it bends just enough that we later call it a turning point. If you could stop time here, freeze the wakes and the propellers and the glances on bridge wings, what would you say to the men leaning over the charts, the pilots listening to a last, brisk briefing? You could tell them the obvious, that 3 carriers will not see another sunrise. You could tell them the less obvious truth, that many of the winning will be done by decisions made a year earlier, about training, about radar, about the simple art of listening to your fighter director's voice. But nobody hears those messages in this hour. What they hear are the voices of their own ships and their own leaders. Launch the cap. Stand by for boogies. Depth 250 feet. On Japanese decks, the flight crews run, their movements choreographed by years of drill and months of hurried replacement. Ozawa stands on Taihō's flag bridge and looks at a sea that seems, for a moment, friend, not foe. Strength lives in ships, he thinks, but power lives in men. He does not know that much of that power has already been expended, quietly, invisibly, in training programs starved for fuel, and in classrooms where instructors are absent because they died 6 months ago over Rabaul. The day Japan lost 3 carriers in one battle is a simple sentence. It is also a long day, with hours that stretch and contract, with voices that are crisp in the morning and tired in the evening, with the sea growing and the light going, and the iron insistence of duty holding men to their decks and cockpits and console seats. In this silence before the first radar plot blooms, the story is still a mystery. Soon it will be a chain of consequences, some expected, many not, and the ocean will be littered with gasoline rainbows and planks and life rafts, and, for a few heartbreaking minutes on a calm patch of water north of Saipan, with men. The first ghosts of contacts appear on American radar, far, faint, and many. Fighter direction officers mark their boards and lift phones. An American submarine's captain turns his periscope out of habit, even though it is useless at this range, and whispers to his fire control party. On Taihō's flight deck, the first Zero, drop tank fat under its wing, breaks free and roars down the deck. The battle is beginning, and across the breadth of it, the ocean keeps its expressionless face. It will be the last neutral witness anyone will ever need. June 19 breaks into action, not with a shout, but with a hum of growing, steady vibration of systems all at once. On the American carriers, the combat information centers glow. A junior officer runs a pencil down a plotting board and watches the arc of incoming boogies inch closer. Radar picket ships outside the main body are already feeding bearings and ranges, a chain of numbers more dependable than eyes. Through practiced calls Angels 15, Vector 090, Taihō fighter directors push squadrons of Hellcats toward the invisible. For years, doctrine was argued in wardrooms. Today, doctrine earns its pay. The Americans have built a way of fighting that starts with seeing first and ends with hitting hardest. The Navy has learned to talk, to pass radar plots from a destroyer to a carrier, from a CIC to the little cube of glass a pilot glances at before he checks his leader's wingtip. The pilots in those blue F-6FS are not invincible, and their planes are not magic. But their training is deep, their radios clear, their gunnery practiced. When the first Japanese fighter bombers and torpedo planes break over the Cap's line, the sky turns into intersecting tracks, the clean geometry of air combat marred gloriously by smoke. On Guam, Japanese ground crews have done their part, turning wrenches, bleeding fuel lines with care learned in hurry. Their pilots are brave. Brave is not enough. Many are fresh from flight school, with fewer hours than an American student has on the day he receives his gold wings. The Zero remains agile, but the Hellcat is fast, tougher, and well flown. The Judy and the Jill dive bomber and torpedo plane can do harm if they get through. The if grows larger with each minute. The phrase Great Marianas Turkey Shoot will be minted later that day by a pilot who is startled by how one-sided the encounters feel. But if you stand with the Japanese aviators in those minutes between initial contact and the last few desperate runs against the American formation, that phrase does not fit. What fits are small human moments. A lead pilot craning for a sliver of ocean where the American wakes should be. A rear gunner loading a drum of 7.7 millimeters rounds with fingers that do not seem to respond after a 2-hour overwater flight. A young man making his first attack run and discovering that the sky is full of tracer lines that have personal intentions. Some get through. A handful of Japanese aircraft press their attacks down the throats of flak bursts and crossing Hellcats and see decks where they expected to see only sky. A torpedo strikes nothing. A bomb, dropped too early, lifts a white gout of water that trenches an American carrier's bow and garnishes it with splinters. The fear among the U.S. sailors burned into them since 1942 that a dive bomber can unpick a carrier's vitals returns for seconds, and then it fades, replaced by the harder, steadier confidence of radar-directed cap and AA crews whose sights are set right. In those 2 hours of morning action, Japanese squadrons die in the dozens. The sea receives them without comment. Some American pilots, too, do not come back. They hit what they chase. They run out of luck. The engine catches fire. Nobody thinks the word turkey. The words used are shorter and rougher, and contain the sounds that keep a man breathing during and after a fight. While the sky rips open, the ocean conducts its own quiet duel. USS Albacore slides into position on the edge of Ozawa's track. She is tired and a little battered, commanded by a man who understands what luck and patience look like in this theater. At periscope depth, she catches sight of huge shadows distorted by a lens and a dream of speed. It could be anything. The sound bearings are good. The math is better. Albacore puts a spread into the water at a target that might be a carrier. It is Taihō. One torpedo finds the flagship. A single hit against a ship engineered to survive one-hit events. A new kind of Japanese. Carrier with an armored flight deck and heavy internal division. Taihō keeps her speed. On her bridge, the admiral's staff breathes out. Down below, damage control teams compartmentalize. Report numbers that look acceptable. The ship lives. Something else enters the air fumes. Gasoline vapor seeps through ventilation, meant to keep men alive. Later, men will speak of a decision to ventilate more aggressively to clear the smell. The smell is cleared. A vapor is spread. Above, flight operations continue. Taihō does what she is built to do: fly aircraft. Below, she carries her doom like a candle carried near a curtain. Around midday, another submarine, USS Cavalla, finds Shokoku. This is a carrier with a name heavy as a bell in American ears, a veteran of past victories and scares. Cavalla stalks, stays at periscope depth, where every second feels like an hour, and finally sees the angle she needs. In her tubes lie fish that, in 1942, too often would not run true. In mid-1944, American torpedoes are mostly what the manuals claim they are. Cavalla fires. 3 torpedoes strike Shokoku. The hits rake through Avgas lines and magazines. Fire climbs. The crew fights. The sea waits. There is an explosion so vast, it remakes the ship in an instant. Her hull buckles. Flames stand where metal was. The carrier that had outrun so much bad luck dies quickly and takes hundreds of men with her. Cavalla goes deep and endures a counterattack that shakes bolts and teeth loose. She survives. On the surface, Shokoku does not. Up above, the air battle continues to be one-sided. American pilots returning toward their carriers in the late morning and early afternoon report a kind of loneliness in the sky. Enemy planes are not absent. Exactly. They are scattered, tired, and poorly coordinated. Fighter directors, whose voices have held steady across 100 calls, experience one of those rare days when their craft, the art of putting one group of men in the right place to meet another group, feels like prophecy instead of procedure. Pilots land, shout their tallies to petty officers with clipboards, and head for the ready room where the coffee is old and everything else is newer than expected. On Taihō, the smell of gasoline is inescapable. She makes knots. She works down the wind for recovery. Perspiration clings to the necks of men standing under ducting. The decision to open the system and push air through the ship is made, and one man, somewhere, flips a switch. It is the kind of action that would be invisible in every other moment of his life aboard. Here, it is the step between life and catastrophe. Fumes ride the air. A spark jumps where it should not. The explosion is a dull building thunder that tears upward and outward at once, snapping steel, flinging men, curling aircraft like paper. Taihō, flagship of the mobile fleet, writhes in the water like a harpooned animal. She does not die immediately, but a dignity leaves her then. Later, as the afternoon ages, she will slide under, carrying Ozawa's flag and much of his hope. The day that breaks 2 carriers is not done. All across the sea east of Saipan, the patterns of battle become less crisp and more ragged. Spruance holds his main body to guard the amphibs. Mitscher fidgets in a professional way, looking for a chance to strike without opening the gate. The Americans are winning and frustrated. The Japanese are losing and do not yet fully understand how badly. On deck, the small alarms remain large enough. A tire bursts on landing and a plane skids toward the deck edge. A young gunner on a destroyer's 40mm mount fires until his shoulder is a single hard knot of pain. A radio man tries 3 times to call his section leader and hears only the wind. By late afternoon, the phrase that will stick is being born in the mouths of pilots who rarely joke about war. They know what they saw. They also know what they did not yet see: a formation of enemy carriers rounded up in their sights and punished. They itch for the strike that seems overdue, for the mission that puts the final punctuation on a day already rich with commas. The sea holds that sentence. It will be written tomorrow, at the cost of a kind of courage that has nothing to do with turning toward a target and everything to do with turning back toward home in the dark. The night holds its breath. June 19th fades without a decisive American counterstrike at the carriers themselves. On the flag bridge, Mitscher weighs duty against desire. He wants to chase. He hears, in everything he has learned about this war, a whisper: drive west and finish it. Sperance's mission is larger: protect the invasion, and he clips the leash just enough. There is no quarrel between them, only responsibility pressing down with different hands. In the Japanese fleet, Ozawa's staff tries to reckon with a reality that is both clear and blurred. 2 carriers are gone. The air groups are shredded. But somewhere in the distances, the Americans are also tired, and as long as Ozawa has decks, he has a weapon. He turns north and west to refuel, husbanding what remains, looking for space to breathe. When dawn returns on June 20th, the ocean is emptier than it ought to be. Search planes range out from Task Force 58, lines of sight stitched into a web that stretches 2, then 300 miles. Every squadron commander in the fleet has a number tattooed in his mind. The distance his type can fly out and back with a margin for fight and luck. At 1540, after hours of nothing, an American scout finds what matters. The mobile fleet, still within reach, running. The call crackles through radios and wires and into the veins of men standing near ready room doors. Range, around 275 miles. Light, already a consideration. The sun is sliding. If they launch now, they will hit at dusk and come back at night. Carrier pilots do not, as a rule, land at night. Not then, not often. Not after 3 hours of overwater flight and a fight. Mitscher decides in a heartbeat measured in lessons learned and lives risked. Launch the strike. The order runs like electricity. On the decks, the ballet begins, the organized violence of men and machines in the 20 minutes that separate planning from takeoff. Hellcats, Avengers, Helldivers fuel, arm, spot. Photographers go to the catwalks to capture an image of airplanes rolling forward into the sun that will, later, pass for poetry. Sailors hold chalkboards with last-minute notes on targets that may have moved. Pilots glance at the horizon and feel their own edges bleed into it. This is the long throw, the mission beyond darkness. They launch in typhoonic air by the hundreds, the carrier's decks shuddering in sequence, blasts of prop wash ripping across whitecaps. The formation gathers as the ocean falls behind. It is a beautiful and terrifying thing. All those wings drawn together, a flock that looks like a decision made visible. 2 hours later, the Japanese fleet grows on the horizon, low and flat, with tiny cotton puffs of flak lifting to meet the first skirmishers. Ozawa's carriers have few fighters to throw, and those that rise meet a storm of American planes flown by men whose principal enemy is now the clock. The attack is ugly and compressed. Avengers slide low, searching for the hulls that move in just the wrong way to accept a torpedo with grace. Helldivers corkscrew down looking for the structure of a carrier in the haze of smoke. Hellcats drop bombs and strafe where they can, amplifying chaos. The targets matter less by name in this moment than by behavior. The one with the clear deck that must be kept busy, the one that already trails smoke and should be finished, the one that feels, by instinct, like the flagship. Among those decks is Taihō, a carrier whose pride is old and whose flat top is large enough to invite attention. Avengers bracket her. At least 2 torpedoes hit, flooding her engine rooms and setting off a sequence of explosions fed by vapor and air. A chain that ends with a rising column of smoke that flattens into a thinking cloud. Taihō rolls and dies. Elsewhere in the target field, Zui Kaku, the last survivor among the 6 carriers that struck Pearl Harbor dances in skilled agony. She takes bombs and lives through them. Light carriers Chiyoda and Kitos wear damage that makes them smaller in a way you can't see from the air. A handful of oilers catch hell as well, because fuel is what holds any fleet together. In half an hour, the strike has ripped Ozawa again, less flamboyantly than the morning's air battles, but more finally. When the last bomb falls and the last torpedo wakes are cut into the sea, the American pilots turn around to face a problem that is older than aviation. Hitting home before the dark makes home meaningless. Mission beyond darkness is not a phrase coined to be romantic. It is a report written by men who turned their fuel cocks, tapped gauges with knuckles, checked the minute hand, and did math that their throats did not believe. The return leg is a prayer said in radio calls in clipped language. They fly into thickening night over Black Ocean, toward carriers also moving and also unsure how to save their own. Some pilots tried to count distance by the time between the sun's edge and its absence. For others, the horizon is simply gone. They fly under black velvet, trusting the dim green lines of their instruments and the voice in their ear that says, steady. On the carriers, Mitscher does a thing no admiral is trained to do, a thing no rule book envisions, and his own blackout order forbids. He orders, turn on the lights. Across Task Force 58, ships blossom into fragile constellations, floodlights pale and inadequate, searchlights pointed up into a sky that can't even reflect, navigation lights click on, deck-edge lanterns are unhooded. Destroyers who know what submarines can do, and what night makes easy, wince and keep the switches thrown anyway. The fleet becomes something visible from miles away, glowing and alive in a dark that wants not to be disturbed. The landings are chaos and courage in equal measure. Planes come in with inches of gas, lanes of light to mark the deck, and men on the signal paddles who wave as if their wrists were the only hinge between worlds. Some pilots make it home neatly, touching down with the easy bounce of a practiced hand. Others do not make it at all. They fly overhead, call the name of a carrier that cannot yet bring them aboard, and then, when the engine coughs that fatal cough, they turn toward the sea and ditch hard. Lights from destroyers streak in arcs, as search crews try to find a lighting flares and men in rafts. The ocean becomes an operating room for the next hours. Pick up, pull aboard, get blankets, go again. About 80 American aircraft will not be recovered that night. Some pilots will never be found. Most will be. The stories written in that water are about skill made kind by the word luck. A man climbs out of a cockpit and into the Pacific and thinks, with idiot clarity, of something that happened at home 2 years ago. A destroyer roars past and a boathook, hurled perfectly, drags him to a ladder. On deck, he vomits fuel and gratitude in the same breath. He will return to the ready room in days. A few will not. As so often in war, the winning day includes small private defeats that do not make the communiques. When dawn comes again, the shape of the victory is clearer. Taihō is gone. Oil slicks mark the places where other ships bled and lived. Ozawa has 3 fewer carriers in his fleet, 2 by submarine's torpedo, and 1 by air attack, and his air arm is a shadow. The tally in the sky is uglier still. Hundreds of Japanese aircraft lost for a fraction of that number on the American side. Task Force 58 is bruised by the night, not beaten, and still whole. Its decks intact, its hulls undamaged, its fighter pilots alive, in a number large enough to take up a row of stools in a bar. The day Japan lost 3 carriers feels, in the sun of June 21st, like a hinge swinging shut. It is not the end. It is the end of something vital. The belief that the Japanese Navy can ever again choose the place and time to strike and win at sea. After the gun camera film is reviewed and the coffee grows cold, the meaning starts to sharpen. You can taste it on the carrier's bridges, in the curt exchanges between ops and intel. This was not Midway, with fireballs caught in black and white, and a quartet of enemy carriers undone in a single morning. This was something quieter, and in its way, more final. The Japanese did not just lose ships. They lost the living core of their carrier arm pilots and maintainers, leaders and learners, fed into a battle they were not prepared to fight and ground to pieces by an American machine designed to give advantage to the better trained and better guided. The machine is made of men. Start with the fighter directors, the calm voices in CICs across the task groups, who took 2D radar plots and made them into 3D decisions with seconds to spare. Add the radar sets themselves, perched on the masts of picket destroyers and cruisers, dragging ghosts out of distance and making them tangible. Add the gunnery crews standing behind 5-inch mounts and 40mm quads, fuses set by analog devices that share none of the romance of a fighter's dash, but all of the importance. Add the pilots, Hellcat and Helldiver and Avenger, who trained in places with names like Jacksonville and Glenview and Taihō. Hand muscles developed on short grass fields and in white-capped practice areas until instinct replaced thought and numbers on a kneeboard turned into survival. The Japanese had once had this kind of machine. In 1941-1942, their carrier pilots were supreme, their air groups cohesive, guided by doctrine that worked, because every piece of it was sustained by experience. That experience has been bleeding out since the South Pacific Campaign. Men lost over Guadalcanal and Rabaul, instructors killed as easily as students, because both flew and both were brave. Fuel shortages meant fewer hours. Hurrying meant less depth. Officers who once cited gunnery figures with pride now talk, wearily, about intake sizes and washout rates. Courage remained. Skill, like any living thing starved too long, withered. It is hard to build empathy across gun sites. It is easier on the sea afterward. American sailors fish Japanese airmen from the water when they can, and some of them are surprised by the face in the life raft. Young in the same way their own pilots are young, frightened in the same way, grateful for a cigarette in the same way. A pilot riding home will say, "We met boys like us," and then struggle to make his narrative allow for both that fact and the brutality of the job he just did. No story is clean. The truth is a stack of ledgers. 40 years of naval thinking, 6 months of pilot school, 1 afternoon's vector call, 2 seconds of fire pressed at the right lead. The balance is paid on the water. Beneath the human choices sit material facts. Taihō, new and tough as a hammer, died not because a hull cracked, but because vapor found a pathway. Shokaku, veteran, died because torpedoes that had failed too often worked perfectly that day. Taihō, older and less well-armored, died because hits came in the wrong place at the wrong time, and the physics of gasoline made a carrier into a kill. In all 3 cases, the instruments of destruction were American torpedoes or bombs, some delivered by submarines that no one remembered standing on a pier and cheering, some delivered by aviators who will have nightmares of a different kind, empty altimeters and black seas. The mission beyond darkness recasts the myth of modern war as reliable. In the ready rooms, pilots had practiced night landings. A few were adept, most were not. Everyone knew that landing a hot, heavy plane on a dark deck was an invitation to catastrophe. The fleet did it anyway. And the image that survives is not a strike photo or a flaming carrier, but a lit-up armada in a war where light meant death. Mitscher's order is remembered as a small thing. It was enormous. It said, "We will risk everything we have for the men in the air." It said, "Victory is not just sinking ships. It is bringing our people home." The destroyers that combed the night ocean for downed pilots wrote their own chapter in courage, throwing mines, lowering boats, backing down in confused seas, weeding flares that looked like constellations dislodged. Ozawa's view deserves a paragraph of its own. He was not a fool or a coward. He did what he was ordered to do with tools that looked, on paper, familiar. He knew his air groups were thin. He knew the Americans had radar and fighters in numbers. He gambled anyway, because the alternative, watching Saipan fall and the inner line crumble, was worse. He was not Nagumo, nor was he Yamamoto. He was the inheritor of a tradition of daring that had been undone first by enemy adaptation and then by attrition. After the battle, he will transfer his flag to Zuikaku's gray hull and count what remains. It will be this simple. He will never again be able to meet the Americans in open ocean and control anything but his own retreat. Spruance will be chewed by some for not chasing harder on the 19th. He will shrug, and history will mostly vindicate him. His job was to protect the Marines on Saipan. He did it. Mitscher will be lauded for the lights and for the throw at dusk, and he will accept the credit with the quiet that career aviators use to hide emotion. Below them, the names that do not make headlines matter most. The skipper of USS Albacore, James Blanchard, gambling on a shot that he could not confirm. The captain of USS Cavalla, John Schwam, holding his periscope just a bit longer to be sure and then paying for it with depth charges. The pilots from Bunker Hill, Bellowwood, Yorktown, Lexington, and other decks who put torpedoes into Taihō and bombs across Ozawa's decks. The signal officers on destroyers who wrote new doctrine in pencil and sweat under red lights. The consequences radiate outward. With the Marianas secured and the Japanese carrier arm neutered, the U.S. can push airfields onto Saipan, Cantinian. B-29s rise and head west, and the war's geography changes. The combined fleet, proud, meticulous, the home of men who measured their lives by notions of seamanship that predated steam, becomes a fleet of symbols. In October, at Lady Gulf, the carriers that once defined Japanese power will be sent north as a decoy, sacrificed to draw Halsey away. Zuikaku will die with flags flying and messages of honor sent in beautiful Japanese phrasing. Chiyoda and Kitose will follow. The last ceremony of the carrier war will be performed by ships that can still move but cannot fight the way they were designed to. The postscript is longer, but the sentence ends here, in June 1944, and in the small places where men keep their memories. The battle is a handful of images, not a chapter title. A petty officer remembers the way a Hellcat's skin looked when it came back from a long flight rubbed raw by speed and salt, the paint mottled in a way he had never seen before. A gunner's mate remembers the smell when the 5-inch mount started to warm, the spice of burnt powder and oil. A Japanese ordnanceman remembers, in the minutes before Taihō died, stuffing an extra drum of ammunition under a knee to keep it from rolling and thinking, absurdly, about the taste of pickled plum in his wife's onigiri. A submariner's son will remember, years later, the way his father used to stare at the yard when the sprinklers turned on at dusk, damp arcs crossing in a pattern like wakes on a calm sea. The day Japan lost 3 carriers in one battle is told in many schools as a tactical blowout and a strategic hinge. It was also an accumulation of choices by individuals pilots who pressed their triggers a second longer, sailors who closed the right hatch and opened the wrong vent, officers who put their names under orders that emphasized protection over pursuit. It is, in other words, human. The lesson is not that victory was inevitable. It is that victory was built in classrooms, in shipyards, in mess halls, where petty officers corrected a recruit's bad habits over the 20th cup of bad coffee, in training flights where nervous laughs covered fear, in the quiet of an engine room where a machinist's mate attended a pump as if it were the only beating heart he would ever have to keep alive. Stand on the Saipan bluffs today, and the Pacific looks altogether innocent. The water folds gently in blues that have no place in a war map. Far over the horizon lies the section of sea where a flagship went up in a kind of dry thunder, where a veteran carrier broke and sank, where another took torpedoes at dusk and rolled with the stubborn grace of ships that know they are dying. Looking out, you would not guess any of it. The ocean keeps secrets well. History does not. It writes them down so we can remember and so we can learn. Look closely at this day in June 1944, and you see more than triumph. You see preparation laid against chance, and chance downgraded by systems that favored competence. You see the cost of depletion, a navy that had once trained masters, now asking apprentices to do impossible work. You see the collision between cautious generalship and the hunter's impulse, resolved by a decision that saved Marines ashore and still reached west with a killing blow. You see guts, a prosaic word that should be set in gold on the flight decks at dusk and on the destroyers bent to rescue lines when the night made everything hard. For the Japanese Navy, the loss was not merely arithmetic. It was identity. Carriers had been the bright coin of a new age, the tools with which the Empire of Japan had shocked America and Britain and the world. Losing 3 in a single battle, along with the air groups that made them more than stripped decks, told a future that lay bare. The carriers that remained would be props in a larger play, written elsewhere in logistics, in factories, in the imagery of long-range bombers taking off from islands that had been Japanese neighborhoods in the Imperial Sea. The path forward for the Imperial Navy narrowed to gestures of courage. Those gestures, however beautiful, could not change physics or math. For the United States, the victory confirmed more than numbers. It proved the fast carrier concept, the marriage of speed and mass and information, and the idea that long reach and quick recovery make a fleet dangerous in a new way. It argued for the anonymous heroes of radar and radio, for the weathered logic of sea-high seas, for the battlefield intelligence functions that tie a fleet together underground and beloutics. It validated boring Marvel's logistics groups of oilers and spare ships and floating workshops, without which none of it makes any sense. The way Task Force 58 could fight all day, and then still choose to light up the sea at night for their returning aviators, was not romance. It was the end state of a supply chain, and a philosophy that put people ahead of equipment when it counted. The men inside the story came home to a country already telling it back to them in headlines that had not seen the ditchings, the rescues, the small sleeve rolls, and hurried prayers. Some, decades on, would shrug when asked about the Turkey Shoot and say that the enemy were brave and unlucky and badly trained. They would reserve their praise for the fighter directors and the kids with paddles, and the destroyer skippers with guts enough to stand lit up in a submarine ocean. Some would remember a moment 5 minutes long, a dark deck spotted with lanterns, a pale rectangle opening like a door to safety, and then memory would refuse to go further. Some would go a different way. A bottle set down on a table with more care than it needed. A story told once, cleanly, and never told again. The lesson is not trapped in wartime. It has purchase now. It says that systems built with care can bend outcomes. That skill and practice and honest acknowledgement of weakness fuel shortages. Pilot pipelines, weapon reliability are more powerful than slogans. That humility and command can coexist with nerve. That someone, someday, will ask you to make a decision that lights up the horizon in a world that wants you to keep it dark. You will either turn on the lights, or you will not. Men's lives will ride on your answer. When we say, the day Japan lost 3 carriers in one battle, we should hear all the echoes. The thump of torpedoes launched by submariners, whose war was fought mostly without witness. The clipped calm of voices aligning fighters to intercept beyond sight. The roar of engines in sunset air, carrying men far past the point where the manual says turn back. The crunchy sound of a ladder under a sailor's hand as he reaches out for a pilot floating in a too large sea. The hollow silence on a Japanese bridge where an officer looks west and knows what his grandchildren will be taught about him. These are the sounds of an ending. In the museums, the models of Shokaku and Taihō and Hayo sit under glass, perfect and tranquil, with tiny airplanes aligned as if time were a photograph taken before anyone moved. Beside them stand models of Essex-class carriers, clean and proud. Next time you pass those cases, bring with you the smell of Avgas and the damp warmth of a CIC and the salt taste around a downed pilot's mouth. Remember the errors that became disasters and the decisions that saved hundreds. See the straight line from Saipan to Tinian to Tokyo. And then, because the sea is as indifferent today as it was then, look out the window toward the blue and remind yourself of the simple truth that loops through all naval history. The ocean is never really yours. It lends itself to you for an hour if you are worthy. If there is a call inside this story, it is a quiet one. Teach thoroughly. Train honestly. Question assumptions kindly, but relentlessly. Care for equipment with reverence, but care for people more. Give credit to the invisible technicians and the loud young warriors in equal measure. In a world that still has horizons and decisions at their edges, we owe that discipline to those who turned on the lights and to those who did not come home even on a winning day. The battle's outcome is fixed. Its meaning is a living thing kept in the telling, guarded by humility, sharpened by memory. The sea holds its silence. We answer with stories, which is the closest thing we have to light that can reach across deep water.